All right, it tells me that I'm recording and I'm ready to start. Can everyone hear me? And, oh, wait a minute. Anyone who can't see my screen and having problems with audio or video? Because when I go to full screen, I can't see any responses. I don't see anything, any problems on chat. So here we go. We're ready to begin after our long introduction. Our first organ system, the integumentary system. So think about what we've done. We've refreshed our memory on those important points about chemistry and cells for living things. We've introduced the language of anatomy. We've introduced the 4 tissue types that we need to talk about an organ system. And here is our first one, the integumentary system, our so-called window on the world. This is what we face the world with. You know, I often think about what's the most important organ system. And of course, if you take a disease and mortality viewpoint, the heart is. More people still die of heart disease than any other malady. But if you take another viewpoint, so for example, if you look at a big major drugstore and you judge on the basis of how much commercial space, how much retail space do they devote to each organ system, you might make a good argument for the integumentary system. All the prescription medicines are behind the counter. You don't even see them. But the integumentary system includes skin, hair, and nails. Now, how many different products do we have on the shelves that are there for the treatment, the changing, whether it's a disease condition or whether it's a cosmetic concern? For the integumentary system, the skin and its integumentary system, its accessory structures. The skin is our first line of defense. It's sort of like the idea of a fort. You build a fort with a great, big, sturdy, strong wall. And that's the strongest part of the fort. And it has to have openings in that wall, and you guard those openings. You defend those openings. And the skin does that for our body. It encloses the entire body in a protective layer. That protective layer is on the outer surface dry. It is impermeable. Things do not routinely enter the body by absorbing through the skin. The first line of defense, and it is keep it out. No, you don't, is the message that our skin presents. Now, right now, we're in a very advanced kind of social structure. Most of our mortality is associated more with social factors and cultural factors than it is with the physical environment. But if you think about living out there, as most wild animals do, where there are pathogens, there are pests, there are diseases, there are exposure to heat and cold, then you can kind of see the value of the skin and its functions. The hair that provides insulation, but also the hair that keeps things off of the surface of the skin. Sometimes thick fur or a heavy skin surface protects you from pests and diseases, pestilence from outside. In fact, the chemicals that were at one time present on our skin, right now we wash them off every day, a couple of times a day, but having sweat that carries salt, so that the outer surface of our skin, when we're not overheated, is salty, it's covered with oil. Each of those exudates has an impact on making the surface of the skin less compatible for things like microbial growth. This outer surface is waterproofed. It consists of dead cells, which are coated with a waterproofing called keratinized cells. They grow from their base many layers down at the junction between the epidermis and the layer below called the dermis. And they're going to constantly be growing toward the surface. And as that happens, those outer cells grow up and slough off. They are automatically shed from the skin. And in fact, it's a primary reason why we continue to change our bedding, because of the insensible perspiration and the residues from oil, from sweat, but also from the shed skin cells. And if you wash your linens several times a month, every week, then you keep that clear, and because the skin is turning over in its thickest areas, the new cell from the base of the epidermis rises to the top and is shed off in about a month's time. So we would certainly turn our skin over 10 times every year, maybe 12. Some areas, it only there's thin skin, we only have to take 2 weeks to grow it up and replace it. So let's take a look at the cross-section of this marvelous organ, our largest organ to go by weight and area. This particular figure shows the 3 layers that we assign to the skin. The outer layer, the window on the world, is our epidermis, and it is bordered here, that wavy line that's right below the purple with the dots in it. Above that line is the epidermis, and this is kind of showing you that from the base, which is a living, growing layer, to the surface, there's a big change. These outer layers, thin, squamous, stratified, dead cells here at the surface, waterproofed, and multiple layers, growing from the base up. Down here in the pink region, we see a transition to connective tissue. So there's going to be that junction that we clearly saw in the slide of the tissues chapter. And this connective tissue is going to be sort of loose connective tissue right here at the top. These mounds, creating the kind of hill and valley look, are called papilla. So this is the papillary layer, and this is loose connective tissue. As you descend through the connective tissue of the dermis, this broad pink region, you see more and more and more fibers, especially reticular fibers. So from here down, we call that the reticular layer. So what we are doing in the dermis is we're building a very firm foundation and then letting it get more flexible, more stretchy. As it gets to the surface, the papillary layer, then we're going to cap that with the waterproof epidermis. As you descend further, you're going to notice the presence of fat cells and the presence of blood vessels that are running parallel to the skin surface. The major supply arterioles, arteries, and arterioles for this skin region. This is the hypodermis, or below the dermis, that makes up the 3rd layer. But you can see we haven't told the whole story. There are all of these strange structures, which are beautifully colored in this figure, indicating that the skin also has glands here and here, indicating they have accessory structures. So this is the base of a hair. You can see the hair shafts protruding above the surface of the epidermis. But you can also see that that hair shaft is embedded very deeply into the dermis. An interesting thing, do you notice that the epidermis follows this hair shaft down and encloses the deepest part, the hair bulb, where the hair cells are dividing, and keratin and pigmentation is going on. The hair is being polymerized into its final form. Notice that those spotted living cells that are purple completely enclose the hair shaft. They enclose this sebaceous gland, even though they are deep in the dermis. It is the epidermal layer that is manufacturing and maintaining them. Here is a muscle that attaches to the base of the hair shaft. This is why we get goosebumps and why our hair can stand up, because a muscle can form it erect. Here are basically the vertical elements departing from the artery that's running in the hypodermis and ascending to form capillary beds not just here, but actually throughout this material right here. You have to be able to, all the way through this integumentary structure, provide enough oxygen and nutrients and remove wastes. So we do have this vertical circulatory element running right up to the base of the epidermis. Notice that it's right at the top of the papilla up here in the dermis. It does not penetrate into the epidermis. The epidermis is very actively growing, and as a result, the skin cells grow quickly. They rise and are sloughed off, and it's such a mobile tissue that we're going to supply the living cells from these capillaries. But as these cells get further and further away, they basically die from lack of oxygen and nutrients. It becomes too thick, and there's no transport up into those upper layers. Accessory structures are shown here with the hair shaft. The other major accessory structure is a nail, not shown in this drawing. But we can also see that the outer surface of the skin is perforated by little holes. The pores, here are pores of sweat glands. This is a sweat gland. Notice here that we have a nerve connecting to the bottom of the sweat gland, and that would be a motor nerve. That motor nerve is going to give the instruction to release sweat. Here is a sebaceous gland. This produces oil, and it is used to lubricate the shaft. By the time the hair grows from the bulb position down here up to midway, these are basically very heavily keratinized cells, more so than the skin, which makes the shaft has what we call body, a stiffness to it, so that it takes the shape of a fiber. And we lubricate the outer part of this shaft to make sure that it can slide out. That means the oil comes out of the hair shaft to cover the skin. Here is the erector muscle for this hair shaft, and the nerve ending shown here in a darker color. So we basically see this nerve wrapping around the base of the hair. If you run your hand above your arm and brush the hair, you can feel it because of the sensory message this sensory nerve would send back toward the brain. Some of these nerve endings have elaborations. You can see a big bulb here and a smaller bulb here. When the nerve endings are wrapped, they are less sensitive, and when the nerve endings are placed deeper in the dermis, they are less sensitive. So the most sensitive would be these bare nerve endings that you see here that are high up in the dermis, providing us with our sensory input from the skin. This skin is going to be sensitive to touch and pressure. By the way, those are two different messages. One is there's something on your skin. It can be as light as a breeze going across the hairs of your skin, or a tick walking across your skin. Or they can be deep pressure, which is a message that says the pressure on your tissues is too great, get your hand out of there. We see these structures throughout the skin, and we're going to examine them one at a time. Functions of the skin are more than just enclosure, protecting the underlying tissues and keep it out. I want you to remember the skin was the first bodily defense mechanism that we have. It's strategy, keep it out. We don't absorb anything regularly through the skin. We also, though, have an outgrowth and a sloughing of cells and a number of secretions. So whenever you have that flow, the body's going to attach certain things for elimination. So salts can be excreted through the skin, water is lost through sweat, and organic wastes are all being expelled through this glandular activity. Because of blood flow, we bring the heat to the surface, the very top of the insulating layer at the base of the epidermis. In order to dump heat, we push the blood into the core in order to conserve heat. So the features of insulation and evaporation are using the thickness of the skin partnered with the ability of the blood to carry heat in order to thermoregulate the body. Now you think about a car engine, it picks up heat from the metal block and takes it to a radiator where it has a lot of surface area. The air blowing through it carries that heat away. It's going to be the same. We may be doing something like, let's say we're running a triathlon. We're in the running or the pedaling, it doesn't matter, or not so much the swimming, the water cools us off, but bicycle or running, we're generating the heat in specific muscle groups, but we're actually dumping the heat by sweating all over the body. The skin is present for the production of our pigments, the coloring in our eyes, in our skin, and melanin being the principal skin pigment that we have. We produce a protein called keratin. Think of this as a shellac. It is a protein. It is fibrous. It is tough. And when you slather it on this living cell and then squash it flat, it hardens the skin, the hair, and the nails into their texture. So the skin has the least keratin, enough to make it waterproof, but still like a raincoat, pretty flexible. You don't want a stiff, brittle skin. It would split when you fell down. But you have this ability to pull the skin, to stretch it, because it has a little keratin. The hair has more for the cells that it covers, and it forms the hair into a column, into a tube that has a certain amount of what we call body, so that you can mold it into a certain position. Finally, the most heavily keratinized cells are found in the nails and the covering of the tips of our fingers to protect those fingertips and to provide our finger and toenails to protect our digits. The skin is also a place where we synthesize one of our D vitamins. D vitamin is important because without D vitamin, we can't absorb calcium. Even if we have enough in our diet, we can't get it out of our digestive tract without vitamin D. And sunlight on skin generates a natural source of vitamin D. We store lipids in our skin through fats, and these materials also act to pad the surface of the skin and also contribute to its flexibility. Finally, this is our window on the world in many ways. We do have our distance senses, so we can see, we can hear, we can smell those things that are away from our body. But how do we assay the effect directly on our body? Through receptors for touch or pressure, through receptors for pain, and through receptors for temperature. We also have proprietary receptors that through a message about stretching tells us the position and the movement of the skin. So let's take a look at epidermis first. Number one, that first word, avascular. Remember that first. Avascular means no blood vessels. No appreciable blood vessels in the epidermis. It is stratified, many, many layers, and we do see a difference in thickness depending on the layer of the body. If there's not much weight on that part of the skin, so for example, right here in the throat, there are places where the skin is very, very thin because there's just not much weight. That in those presents, a very, very thin skin. In other places, like the palms of our hands, the soles of our feet, and heel, those have an extra layer and many, many, many callousy layers because of the high abrasion that they encounter. Wherever there's abrasion, or wherever there's a stretching or a weight applied to the skin, the number of layers goes up. The outer layers of the epidermis, as I said, those outer layers are dead and ready to be sloughed. They are keratinized. In fact, there's a special term, keratinocytes, for these outer skin cells. They're constantly sloughed off at a high rate. And as I said, there are places in our body we turn over probably plus 20 times per year in the thin skin. The skin is a natural protection against penetration and invasion are usually the same thing. Benign materials are foreign objects that the body will often react to. The skin acts to keep them out. Pathogens produce infection. Toxins produce poisoning. And the way that the epidermis grows is a strategy for the constant replacement of skin cells and the protection of our body. If you basically could separate the epidermis, as seen here in this peel-back layer, from the dermis, you would see this range of little mountain peaks, little domes, and little depressions. They match the domes and depressions on the underside of the epidermis, which is not shown in this drawing. That's too bad, because these domes, called dermal papilla, match the topography of the lower surface, the so-called epidermal ridges and valleys. Now, before we saw, when surfaces were not flat, when they were convoluted, we saw folding and shapes like fingers and shapes like bunches of grapes and stacks of coins. And we said increased surface area was the reason. It is the same principle here. When you fold the upper surface of the dermis into these peaks and valleys, then you increase the surface area for connection. And here we're talking about hemidesmosomes locking this epidermal layer, this lowest level called the stratum basale, which would run right along the base of the epidermis, locking it tightly so that here's what we have in the skin. It does not frequently split. It will move if you fall down, but it's more common that you will provide a scrape rather than split the skin open because of its stretchiness and its flexibility. And that's supported by the areolar layer, which is light connective tissue, down to the reticular layer of the dermis below. So when we look at these two cross sections, we see a very, very clear junction between the connective tissue below. Here's the border of the connective tissue at the pointer in thin skin. Likewise, here's the border in thick skin. And you can see the main difference is this outer layer called the stratum corneum. These are the keratinocytes, and this is what's meant by this figure. You see that tan layer? That's the stratum corneum shown here. There are 5 basic layers that we'll name in just a moment in the transition from living cells. Now, these are the stem cells, the dividing cells, right along that basal layer of the epidermis. The capillaries coming up are right here in the upper layer of the dermis, so the oxygen supply, the nutrient supply, the waste removal is excellent right here, and that's enough for active cell division, and these cells then being pushed up by the new cells appearing below through 5 layers on their trip to the outer surface. Those 5 layers beginning at the base are named the stratum basale, the stratum spinosum, spiny, the stratum granulosum, grainy. The stratum lucidum is a 4th layer, but is only found in the thick skin on our palms and soles. And finally, something that all of them have, a stratum corneum. Now, in thinking about these layers, it makes sense why they have that appearance. Here is the stratum basale, the germ layer that is dividing to produce new daughter cells, and those cells grow. They grow along and are attached to the upper layer here of the connective tissue, the papillary layer of the dermis below. But as they grow, these older cells get pushed away from the boundary. And as they get pushed away, they get pushed further and further from the capillary beds. That means that they start to dry out. As they dry out, the cell shrinks. and the membrane contracts and falls down onto the cytoskeleton, where the membrane drapes over an element of microtubule or microfiber, the cytoskeleton. It forms a little point or spine. As they go further away from the spinosum, they dry out further, and precipitation occurs in the cytosol. So things that were dissolved, now there's not enough fluid to hold everything in solution. So grains begin to form inside the cytoplasm, stratum granulosum. Now this is thick skin, and the layer, this little opening here, and this little opening over here shows you the stratum lucidum, a clear layer that exists only in thick skin. Because thick skin is present where abrasion is highest, it represents a place where there's additional peeling that's possible. Above that, we're in keratinocytes and the flat, dead, keratinized cells. Up here above, by the way, this rupturing is caused by the blade when you use a microtome to cut the surface, to cut a section. So it will naturally kind of split. You can see the effect of having a more brittle, a more hard and flattened cells that can be peeled off or separated one from another once they're dried out. But up above, you can kind of also see the effects of sloughing as these points or these rays are beginning to break free and will eventually just fall off the surface of the skin. Keratinization is the formation of a waterproof cell from a protein that is actively made in these skin cells. The cells that have been treated this way are called keratinocytes. It changes their shape, it changes their appearance. All exposed skin surfaces have keratin, except the eyes. The eyes have to allow for absolute uninterrupted penetration of the light, and keratin interrupts that straight line transmission. The skin life cycle. This surprised me the first time I read it. It takes between 15 and 30 days for a cell to move from its origin, from cell division, and migrate its way from the stratum basale all the way up to the stratum corneum. So you think about that, 30 days, that's once a month, 12 times a year in the thicker skin. Every 15 days, 24 times a year in skin that is thinner. And here we're talking about the number of times that the skin turns over in a specific location in the body. The stratum basale, the layer of cell division, attached to the basal layer, the connective tissue of the papillary layer of the the dermis by hemidesmosomes. There's a strong bond between the epidermis and dermis. That's why you don't pull the epidermis off, you simply stretch. There are epidermal ridges that form fingerprints that are unique to each person. The dermal papillae are the tiny mounds to increase the surface area and give you more space to form hemidesmosomes and hold that epidermis down. The basal cells are germinative. That means stem cells. That means dividing cells, making new cells all the time. Here is a scanning electron micrograph, but only 25 times magnification, showing you a very high resolution look at the epidermal ridges or fingerprints that are forming on the outer surface of this thick skin. You can see something here that you normally don't notice. Those little indentations are the pores of sweat gland ducts from the sweat glands that are held in the thick skin below. Regarding those ducts, we have two types of water loss. Right now, my skin feels comfortable with respect to temperature, and it feels dry to the touch. But I am experiencing a certain amount of water loss all over my body. This is called insensible perspiration, and it comes from the fluid that's lost that makes its way through the stratum corneum and evaporates off the surface of the skin. Now, this is constant, and it's going on all the time. It does affect our hygiene. So one of the things that we experience in our bedding, we cover ourselves with sheets and blankets. The insensible perspiration makes our bedding slightly damp in the morning. And so we need to have a porous enough surface that it can evaporate. One of the reasons we change our socks, one of the reasons we change our shoes is because of insensible perspiration, making those damp during the day. If we exercise, we add to that water that's excreted under exertion. And this is by the sweat glands as a mechanism of thermoregulation. Now, this can you can over-exercise, or you can be trapped in an environment that's too hot and suffer dehydration from this sensible perspiration. But this is the visible sweat that we see on our skin surface. If we damage the stratum corneum, the water loss by insensible perspiration goes up a great deal. So things especially like a blistering of the skin that causes a separation of epidermal layers and a thinning of the epidermis, or burns that damage or remove the epidermis, make temperature control very, very difficult. You can also dehydrate from immersion in a hypertonic, so seawater and osmosis can dehydrate a person faster than they would normally dehydrate. Fresh water hydrates the epidermis, but very little penetrates below to where a capillary could pick it up. So the reason our fingertips get pruny is the water increases the size, and the only way it can stay tacked down to the dermis below is if it forms ridges. So a good example of how swelling cells will produce a kind of a folded or ridged appearance beyond the fingerprints, that pruny appearance, that results of and increases the surface area. But the water doesn't appreciably enter the underlying tissues. Skin color is affected by two principal pigments. I want to mention carotene first. It's orange. It was named because it was first isolated and described from carrots. But it's used for a number of things. It produces a dark orange color. It produces that red on red hair color. But it is a precursor of vitamin A as well. Vitamin A is important in the pigments in our retinal cells in the eye. And carotene is present in epidermal cells and also fat in the dermis, giving it a yellow color. Melanin is our principal pigment, and melanin can be in dilute form, is a kind of a yellow color, but in greater and greater concentrations becomes a darker and darker brown, and eventually going to almost a black color. Melanin is introduced into the cell in the stratum basale by a special cell. There it is, melanocytes. The melanocyte is a cell that is very branched, and its cell membranes spreads out over a large area of the stratum basale, is membrane to membrane in contact with many cells of the stratum basale. Now, this pigment is introduced in the stratum basale, and these dark pigments then are transferred to the stratum corneum by that upward growth. Melanin has a protective function. It lessens the penetration of ultraviolet light, and ultraviolet light causes mutations, so it keeps it out of the delicate tissues that are below. Now, in lighter-skinned persons, sunscreen is necessary to lessen that UV penetration. Another pigment is hemoglobin. The red blood cells carry it, and it gives us a reddish flush. The blushing that comes from embarrassment, or the reddish color of many people's skin when they exercise, comes from blood going to the very surface of the dermis And in the thin areas, the light can get through the epidermis, bounce off the red blood cells, and come back out. So it's actually the flushing with blood that you're seeing. Likewise, if the cell is deoxygenated, in areas of thin skin, you'll see a bluish color called cyanosis. That's the color of hemoglobin in oxygen-depleted condition. So here are some of the figures that illustrate these principles. Here's the papilla of the dermis. See the scattered cells and the connective tissue, non-living matrix that's between them. And as we transition over into the epidermis, you can see these little brown clouds around the stratum basale cells. Those are melanin pigments. The melanocytes themselves are spread out so fine and so thinly that you actually can't see a melanocyte very directly. I think they labeled these. This one is probably a corner of the cell body of a melanocyte. The drawing gives you a better idea. You can see how the dendrites of the melanocyte basically invade the surrounding stratum basale. So there's a lot of contact between the manufacturing cell that's putting out these crystals of melanin and the growing cells of the epidermis. So you can see in this central area, melanin has been transferred to the cytosol of the stratum basale up to the stratum spinosum, all the way up to the extent of the top of these arms of the melanocyte, and then they carry that pigment forward as they rise through the stratum spinosum, granulosum, lucidum if it's thick skin, and eventually to the stratum corneum. When you dehydrate the cell and flatten it, the melanin stays there intact and produces a very opaque and colored cell. We do have mutations of epidermal cells. These are showing as growth on the outer surface. This one is a basal cell carcinoma. A cell has converted to cancerous growth and is proliferating. You can see it's kind of formed differently in appearance than the surrounding normal skin. Generally, these are slower growing and not as dangerous. They can be removed or treated by a variety of treatments, ranging from freezing using liquid nitrogen as the heat extractor, to immune treatments, which can be rubbed on the surface of some basal cell carcinomas, all the way to surgical removal by a thing called Mohs surgery. Now, this is a surface tumor that results from the mutation of a melanocyte. Because the melanocytes are in contact with and affect so many cells, this is a very rapid growing tumor and very dangerous. And so melanocyte cancer, or melanoma, is one of our more serious and lethal skin cancers. Now, I think this is a great place to stop right in the middle of pigments. Next time, we're going to talk about skin color and how the abnormal production of some pigments produces a colored appearance to the skin that allows us to diagnose the beginning of problems